"You're not one of us, so stop pretending," Ethan Whitmore said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. And just like that, the laughter died. Glasses paused midair, and every pair of eyes turned toward Marcus Reed standing near the edge of the long dining table, his fingers still wrapped around a cheap paper gift bag that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. The golden chandelier above casting a cold reflection across polished marble, while the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine lingered in the air like something he didn't belong to. And for a moment Marcus didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if the words needed time to settle into his bones, as if maybe, just maybe, someone would say something to stop it. But no one did. Not his aunt adjusting her diamond bracelet, not his uncle swirling his glass without looking up, not even the woman at the head of the table, his mother, who kept her eyes fixed on her plate like silence was safer than choosing him. And that silence said more than anything else ever could, because this wasn't new. Not really. It had been building for years in smaller ways, in side glances and half-finished conversations, in the way they introduced him to guests without mentioning his last name, in the way they asked what he was doing these days, with polite smiles that never waited for real answers. Marcus swallowed slowly, his throat dry, his heart beating just a little too loud in his chest. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out calm, almost too calm, like he had practiced holding it together. "I brought something for Mom," he said, lifting the bag slightly. But Ethan let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive. "We're not doing charity tonight, Marcus." And a few quiet chuckles followed, not loud, not cruel enough to be called out, just enough to sting. Marcus glanced down at the bag, then back up, his eyes landing on his mother again, waiting, hoping for something, a word, a look, anything. But she didn't move, didn't speak, and that was when something inside him shifted, not anger, not even hurt, just a quiet understanding settling in like cold air. He nodded once, slowly, like he had finally heard what they had been saying all along. "All right," he said softly, setting the bag down on the edge of the table. With careful hands, the thin paper crinkling under his touch. "I won't stay long." And for a second, no one stopped him, no one reached out. The only sound was the faint clink of silverware as someone resumed eating too soon. Pretending the moment had already passed, Marcus turned toward the door, his footsteps steady against the hardwood floor, each one echoing just a little louder than the last. And as he reached the hallway, the warmth of the dining room fading behind him, he heard Ethan's voice again, lower this time, almost casual. "You should have figured it out by now." And Marcus paused, not long, just enough to let the words land completely, before continuing forward without looking back, the front door opening with a soft creak, a rush of cool evening air brushing against his face as he stepped outside, the distant hum of traffic and the faint glow of streetlights replacing the polished silence of the house behind him. And for the first time that night, his shoulders dropped, just slightly, like something heavy had finally been set down, not forgiven, not forgotten, just understood. And as the door closed quietly behind him, no one inside noticed that he didn't come back. The door clicked shut behind Marcus, soft but final, and the quiet that followed felt louder than everything that had just happened inside. He stood on the front steps for a moment, the cold evening air settling against his skin, the kind that made you aware of your breathing, slow and uneven, as if your body was still catching up to what your mind had already accepted. He glanced down at his hands, empty now, the faint crease from the paper bag still pressed into his fingers like a memory that refused to let go. Then he exhaled and stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching under his shoes with each measured step, steady, controlled, like he was making a decision with every foot forward. The house behind him glowed warm and bright through tall windows, silhouettes moving, glasses lifting, laughter slowly returning as if he had never been there at all. And that realization did not break him, not anymore. It just settled into place like the last piece of something he had been trying to understand for years. Across the street his car sat under a flickering streetlight, an old sedan with faded paint and a dent near the rear door. Nothing like the polished vehicles lined along the Whitmore driveway. He reached it, paused with his hand on the handle, and for a second his reflection stared back at him through the dark glass. Tired eyes, steady jaw. A man who had learned how to stand without being seen. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, The interior smelled faintly of coffee and worn fabric. Familiar, honest. He sat there without starting the engine, just listening, the ticking of cooling metal, the distant hum of traffic, his own heartbeat finally slowing into something quieter, something controlled. Then his gaze shifted to the passenger seat, where a thin folder rested, edges slightly bent, a name printed clearly on the front in clean black letters. Read. Marcus. Beneath it a series of documents neatly stacked, contracts, financial statements. Things no one at that dinner table would have ever imagined he understood. He reached over and picked it up, flipping it open slowly, his eyes scanning lines of numbers and signatures, the language of a world he had stepped into without telling them, not because he wanted to hide, but because he had stopped needing their approval a long time ago. His phone buzzed softly in the cup holder, the sound sharp in the quiet. He glanced at the screen, an email notification lighting up the darkness. Subject: final confirmation. He stared at it for a second, then tapped it open, the glow reflecting in his eyes as he read. The corners of his expression barely shifting. Not a smile, not pride, just recognition, like something long in motion had finally reached its point. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across his windshield before fading into the distance. He closed the email and set the phone down, then leaned back in his seat, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his fingers tapping once, twice, a quiet rhythm. Before stilling completely, inside the house across the street, someone raised a toast, voices lifting, glasses clinking, celebrating something that felt important in that moment. Unaware that something else had already begun to change, Marcus started the engine, the low hum filling the car, steady and calm. And as he pulled away from the curb, he did not look back, not at the lights, not at the shadows behind the windows, not at the place that had just made its choice, because for the first time, he was not leaving empty. He was leaving with something they had never seen, something they would not understand until it was far too late. You really think walking away makes you different from them? The voice echoed faintly in Marcus's mind as the car moved through the quiet streets, headlights stretching long across the asphalt, and for a brief second his grip on the steering wheel tightened, not out of anger but out of memory, because those words were not new. They had followed him long before tonight, long before the Whitmore house, back to smaller rooms, tighter spaces, places where expectations were already decided before. He even spoke. He drove past a row of closed storefronts, neon signs flickering in tired colors, the city thinning out as he crossed into a part of town where the sidewalks cracked and the streetlights hummed instead of shined. And yet there was something steady here, something real. He turned into a narrow parking lot behind a modest brick building, the sign above the entrance dim but still readable, Reed Community Resource Center, the paint slightly worn at the edges like it had been holding on longer than anyone expected. Marcus parked the car and sat there for a moment, engine still running, the soft vibration beneath him grounding, reminding him where he actually stood. Then he reached for the folder again, flipping it open not to read, but to confirm, to remind himself that what he had built was not imagined, not temporary. It was real. Every number, every signature, every quiet decision made in rooms far removed from where he started. His phone buzzed again, a call this time. The name on the screen simple and direct, Daniel Harper. Marcus let it ring once, twice, before answering, lifting the phone to his ear without speaking first. You saw the confirmation? Daniel's voice came through, calm, professional, but with an edge of something else beneath it, something closer to anticipation. Marcus leaned his head back slightly against the seat, eyes closing for just a second. I saw it, he replied, his voice even, steady, the kind that did not need to prove anything. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet exhale. Good, because this moves faster than we expected. The Whitmore Holdings are more unstable than their public filings suggest. They have been covering losses for at least 18 months. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. Once, twice, the rhythm controlled, deliberate. How long before they notice? He asked, already knowing the answer would not change what came next. Not long, Daniel said. But by then it will not matter. The controlling stake will already be locked. Silence settled between them for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just full, like both men understood the weight of what was being set into motion. Marcus opened his eyes and looked through the windshield toward the building ahead, the dim light above the entrance flickering once before holding steady. "Make sure everything stays clean," Marcus said quietly. "No pressure tactics, no shortcuts." Daniel let out a soft, almost amused breath. "You are about to own the company that turned its back on you, and that is your concern?" Marcus's expression did not change. "It is not about them," he said, his voice lower now, firmer. "It never was." Another pause, longer this time. Then Daniel responded, more serious. "Understood." The call ended without anything else. Marcus lowered the phone slowly, setting it back in the cup holder, his reflection faint in the windshield again, but different now, not because of what he had gained, but because of what he had chosen not to become. He turned off the engine, the sudden quiet settling around him like a held breath finally released. Then he stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against his face as he closed the door gently behind him. No rush, no hesitation, just movement forward, toward the small building that had never asked him to prove he belonged. And as he walked under the flickering light, keys in hand, there was no trace of the man they had dismissed hours ago. Only someone who had already begun to change a future they did not even realize was coming. "You still open this place every night?" A quiet voice came from the doorway just as Marcus turned the key, the lock clicking softly before the door eased open, and he paused for a fraction of a second, not startled, just aware, before glancing over his shoulder to see Mrs. Alvarez standing under the dim hallway light, her coat pulled tight, a small grocery bag resting in her hand, the faint scent of rain following her inside as she stepped in slowly, careful, like she did not want to disturb something fragile. Marcus gave a small nod, pushing the door wider. "Someone has to," he said, his voice low, steady, the kind that filled the space without demanding attention. The lights flickered once before coming fully alive, revealing a narrow room lined with folding chairs, a worn couch along the far wall, and a whiteboard covered in notes and schedules written in careful handwriting. Nothing polished, nothing expensive, but everything intentional. Mrs. Alvarez set the bag down on a nearby table, her eyes moving around the room like she was taking inventory of something deeper than objects. "You left early tonight," she said gently, not accusing, just noticing. Marcus walked past her, setting his keys down beside a stack of papers. "Something came up," he replied, simple, contained. But she studied him for a moment longer than usual, as if she could see the edges of what he was not saying. "Family?" she asked softly, and that word lingered in the air longer than anything else had. Marcus did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for a chair, pulling it out and setting it in place with quiet precision, the legs scraping lightly against the floor, a small, grounding sound. "I stopped by," he said finally, not looking at her, and she nodded slowly, like that was enough to understand the rest. No questions, no sympathy offered too loudly, just presence, the kind that did not need to prove itself. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt heavier in the silence. Marcus moved to the whiteboard, erasing a section and rewriting a schedule for the next day, his handwriting neat, deliberate, each letter formed like it mattered, like this space mattered. "You know," Mrs. Alvarez said after a moment, her voice softer now, almost reflective, "people only push away what reminds them of what they are afraid to face." Marcus paused, marker hovering just above the board, then continued writing, the words settling without argument, not accepted, not rejected, just placed somewhere he would come back to later. A few minutes passed before the door opened again, this time quicker, more familiar. A young man stepped in, hoodie damp from the outside air. "Hey Marcus, we still good for tomorrow?" Marcus turned slightly, nodding once. 6 in the morning, he said. "Do not be late." The young man smiled, relieved, and moved toward the back, dropping his bag near the couch. And just like that the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough to feel alive. Marcus stepped back from the whiteboard, looking over the space, the chairs, the worn floor, the quiet signs of effort that no one at that dinner table would have ever noticed, and for a brief second, his gaze softened, not with regret, not with longing, but with something steadier, something earned. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, but this time he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he walked toward the table, opening the grocery bag Mrs. Alvarez had brought. Inside neatly packed containers, sandwiches, fruit, small things that kept people going. He set them out one by one, methodical, present, and only after everything was in place did he take the phone out, glancing at the screen briefly before turning it face down on the table without reading it. Whatever was waiting could wait a little longer, because here, in this small room under flickering lights and quiet determination, Marcus was not the man they had dismissed. He was the one building something they could never measure, something that did not need their approval to matter. "You do all this and still show up before sunrise?" the young man asked, his voice half curious, half disbelieving, as he leaned against the doorway with a sandwich in his hand, and Marcus did not answer immediately. He just adjusted the stack of papers on the table, aligning the edges with quiet precision before finally looking up. "Showing up is the easy part," he said, his tone even, not dismissive, just honest. The kind of answer that did not try to sound impressive. The room had settled into a low rhythm now, the soft rustle of wrappers, the faint hum of an old heater kicking in, footsteps moving lightly across the worn floor, small sounds that built something steady, something real. Marcus walked toward the back of the room, picking up a folded jacket someone had left behind and placing it neatly over the back of a chair, a simple gesture, but deliberate, like everything else he did here. His phone buzzed again on the table, longer this time, persistent, the screen lighting up against the dim room, and this time Mrs. Alvarez noticed, her eyes shifting toward it before returning to him. "You might want to check that," she said gently, not pressing, just offering. Marcus glanced at the phone, then away, continuing what he was doing. "It will still be there," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made the young man in the doorway pause, like he was hearing more than just words, like he was seeing a different way of choosing what mattered. The heater clicked louder, pushing out a wave of warm air that carried the faint scent of old metal and dust, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the quiet itself felt full. Marcus finally walked back to the table, his hand hovering over the phone before picking it up, the screen bright against his palm. A new message now, not from Daniel, but from an unknown number, the preview short, direct. "We need to talk about Whitmore Holdings." Marcus's eyes held on it for a second longer. Then necessary. Then he unlocked the phone, reading the full message, his expression unchanged, controlled, but something subtle shifted in the stillness of his posture. Not tension, not hesitation, just awareness, like a door had quietly opened somewhere far ahead. "Everything all right?" the young man asked, stepping a little closer now, curiosity replacing hesitation. Marcus locked the phone again, setting it face down with the same calm precision as before. "Yeah," he said, a small nod. Following, "Just business." The words sounded simple, but they carried weight that did not need explanation. The young man nodded back, accepting it without fully understanding, and moved toward the table to grab another sandwich. Life continuing in small, practical motions, Marcus leaned his hands lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze drifting across the room, the chairs, the people, the quiet effort that held everything together, and for a moment, the memory of the dinner table flickered back, the polished surfaces, the controlled smiles, the carefully measured words, and the contrast did not sting anymore. It clarified. It separated what was real from what only looked like it. Mrs. Alvarez stepped beside him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Whatever they are about to realize," she said softly, "it will not change who you chose to be." Marcus did not respond right away, his eyes still on the room, on the people who trusted this place to exist tomorrow and the day after that. Then he nodded once, slow, certain. "It never has," he said quietly, and as the heater settled into a steady hum and the last of the food was laid out, the phone remained still on the table, silent now, but carrying something inevitable, something already moving toward them, unseen. And for the first time, it was not a question of if it would reach this room, but when. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" the young man asked quietly as the room began to thin out, chairs scraping softly against the floor as a few people gathered their things, and Marcus stood near the whiteboard erasing the last line of tomorrow's schedule, the marker leaving faint gray shadows where words had been. He paused at the question, not turning right away, just standing there with the cloth in his hand. Then he shook his head once, small, almost unnoticeable. "No," he said, his voice calm, certain, like the answer had been decided long before it was asked. The young man nodded slowly, as if he had expected something more complicated, but accepted it anyway, and stepped outside into the night, the door closing with a soft click behind him. The room grew quieter after that, the heaters still humming, the lights buzzing faintly overhead. Mrs. Alvarez moved toward the sink in the corner, rinsing out a container with slow, practiced motions, water running steady, and Marcus finally reached for his phone again, picking it up with a deliberate motion, his thumb hovering for a moment before unlocking it. The message still there, unchanged, but now joined by another. This one from Daniel, shorter, more urgent. "They are asking questions." Marcus read it once, then again, his expression steady, but his eyes sharpening slightly. Like a lens coming into focus, he tapped the screen, calling Daniel back. The line connected after a single ring. "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, already stepping away from the table, his voice low enough to keep the room undisturbed. "Internal," Daniel replied, his tone controlled but tighter than before. "Board level." They flagged irregular movements in the capital flow. Nothing concrete yet, but they are looking. Marcus walked slowly toward the front window, the glass reflecting his silhouette against the dark street outside. "How much time?" he asked, watching a car pass by, its headlights sweeping across the room before fading. "Less than we thought," Daniel said. "If they connect the holding company to you before the transfer is complete, they will try to block it." Marcus's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the window frame, tapping once, a quiet, measured sound. "Then we finish it before they understand what they are seeing," he said, not rushed, not aggressive, just precise, like placing the final piece in a structure that had already been built. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Daniel spoke again, more carefully this time. "Marcus, once this goes through, there is no keeping a distance anymore. Your name will be tied to it, publicly." Marcus's reflection stared back at him in the glass, steady, unchanged. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than hesitation ever could. "Just make sure everything stays clean," he added, echoing his earlier words. "No surprises." Daniel exhaled softly. "Understood." The call ended, and Marcus lowered the phone slowly, his gaze still fixed on the reflection in the window, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging what was coming. Behind him, the water shut off, the room settling into a deeper quiet. Mrs. Alvarez dried her hands and looked over at him, her eyes thoughtful but calm. "Something is changing," she said, not asking, just stating what she could feel in the air. Marcus turned slightly, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah," he said, a faint nod following. "It is." She studied him for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. "Just remember," she said gently, "what you build matters more than what you take." Marcus held her gaze for a second, then nodded once, slow and certain. "That is why I built it first," he replied. And as the lights flickered slightly before settling again, the room felt the same, unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, something had already shifted, something quiet and irreversible, moving forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. "You are not going to be able to keep this quiet much longer," Daniel's voice echoed from earlier, and now those words felt closer, heavier. As Marcus stood alone in the center of the room after everyone else had left, the chairs pushed back into place, the lights dimmed to half, casting long shadows across the worn floor. He walked slowly toward the table, his fingers brushing lightly against its surface as if grounding himself in something solid, something that had not changed. The phone rested where he had left it, still, silent, but carrying everything that was about to unfold. He picked it up again, not to check messages this time, but to open a different file, one he had not needed to revisit in years. A scanned document appeared. On the screen, edges slightly faded, the date stamped in the corner from decades ago, his name printed clearly. "Read, Marcus." Beneath it another line, smaller, but just as permanent. "Adopted into the Whitmore family." Marcus stared at it without expression, but his thumb hovered over the screen like there was more weight in that image than numbers or contracts could ever carry. The memory surfaced quietly, not loud, not dramatic, just a room, a pen, a woman signing her name with a steady hand. while a younger version of him sat beside her, unsure of what it meant, but certain it was supposed to matter. He locked the phone and set it down again, slower this time, more deliberate, the sound of it touching the table soft but final. He exhaled and moved toward the window once more, the street outside nearly empty now, a single streetlight flickering as if it could not decide whether to hold on or give out. And for a moment, Marcus let himself stand still, not thinking about the deal, not about the Whitmores, just about the space between what had been given and what had been taken away. Behind him, the quiet creak of the door broke the stillness. He turned slightly to see Mrs. Alvarez stepping back in, her coat draped over her arm, like she had forgotten something but could not quite leave yet. She studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "You built this place like it was home." Marcus glanced around the room. The chairs, the board, the small details that no one else would notice. "It is," he replied. "Simple, certain." She nodded slowly, then stepped further inside, closing the door behind her with care. "Then whatever you are about to walk into," she said, her voice steady but gentle, "do not let it take that away from you." Marcus did not answer right away, his gaze drifting back to the window, to the reflection staring back at him. Not the boy who had once been brought into a family, not the man they had dismissed hours ago, but something quieter, more grounded, someone who had chosen his place rather than waited for it to be given. His phone vibrated again, sharper this time, insistent. He picked it up and looked at the screen, a new message. This one unmistakable, from a number he recognized even without a name attached. "The Whitmore residence," the words short, almost formal. "We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding the company." Marcus read it once, then again, the corners of his mouth not moving, his eyes steady, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. He locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket, not responding. "Not yet." Mrs. Alvarez watched him carefully. "Are you going to answer?" she asked quietly. Marcus shook his head once, slow, controlled. "Not tonight," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just timing, precise and intentional. He walked toward the door, turning off the last light as he passed, the room dimming into shadow except for the faint glow from outside. And as he opened the door, the cool night air met him again. Familiar now, steady. He stepped out, pausing just long enough to glance back inside, at the place he had built without permission, without recognition. And then he closed the door gently behind him, the lock clicking into place, not as an ending, but as something held safe, while everything else outside began to shift. "You are late," Daniel said quietly the next morning, his voice coming through the phone as Marcus stepped out of his car into the sharp chill of early dawn. The sky still a muted gray, the city not fully awake, and Marcus closed the car door with a soft thud, adjusting his jacket as he looked up at the tall glass building in front of him, its reflective surface catching the first hint of light. "I am right on time," Marcus replied, his tone calm, measured, as he began walking toward the entrance, the concrete beneath his shoes still holding the cold from the night before. Inside, the lobby was nearly empty, a security guard glancing up briefly before returning to his screen, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Marcus moved past the front desk without hesitation, his steps steady, controlled, like he had been here before even if no one recognized him. "They called an emergency board meeting," Daniel continued, his voice lower now, more focused. "Half of them do not know why yet, but Ethan does, and he is not waiting." Marcus stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the top floor, the doors sliding shut with a smooth, muted sound. "Good," Marcus said simply, watching his reflection in the brushed metal doors. He should not. The elevator began its ascent, a soft mechanical hum surrounding him, numbers lighting up one by one, steady, inevitable. Daniel paused for a moment on the line, then asked, "Are you sure about this?" Marcus did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on his own reflection, not searching, not questioning, just present. "I was sure the moment they decided I did not belong," he said finally, his voice even, without bitterness, just clarity. The elevator slowed as it reached the final floor, the doors opening into a wide hallway lined with glass walls and quiet tension. Voices carried faintly from the conference room ahead, sharper than usual, less controlled. Marcus stepped out, ending the call. Without another word, slipping the phone into his pocket as he walked forward, each step measured, deliberate, the sound of his shoes barely audible against the carpeted floor. Inside the conference room, Ethan Whitmore stood near the head of the table, his posture rigid, his voice cutting through the air. "We need to identify who is behind this before it is too late," he said, his tone controlled but strained. Several board members shifted in their seats, papers spread across the table, screens glowing with data they did not fully understand. One of them spoke up, uncertain. "The holding company. It is layered, anonymous. There is no direct name attached." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "There is always a name," he replied, sharper now. "We just have not found it yet." A quiet knock interrupted the tension, soft but precise, and every head turned toward the door as it opened slowly. Marcus stepped inside without rushing, his presence calm, grounded, completely out of place, and yet impossible to ignore. For a second, no one spoke, the air in the room shifting, tightening. Ethan's eyes locked onto him immediately, confusion flashing before something else took its place, something sharper, more defensive. "You should not be here," Ethan said, his voice low, controlled. But Marcus did not stop walking, moving further into the room with quiet certainty. "I was invited," Marcus replied, his tone steady, neutral, as he reached the table and placed a single folder down in front of him, the same one he had carried the night before, its edges worn but its contents precise, deliberate. One of the board members leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "And you are?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a test. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "Someone who already is," he said calmly. And as the room fell into a deeper silence, the weight of that sentence settled in ways none of them were ready to understand yet. "Open it," one of the board members said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness like something fragile had just been placed in the center of the table. And for a moment no one moved, not even Ethan, whose eyes remained fixed on Marcus with a mixture of disbelief and something less defined, something closer to unease. Marcus did not rush. He simply placed his hand on the folder, sliding it forward an inch before flipping it open with a controlled, deliberate motion. The soft sound of paper against wood echoed louder than it should have in the silence. Inside, neatly organized documents rested in precise order: contracts, ownership structures, financial summaries, every page aligned like it had been prepared for this exact moment. The board member closest to him leaned in, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the first page, his expression shifting almost immediately, confusion tightening into focus. "This is not possible," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Another member reached over, pulling the document closer, eyes moving quickly across lines of text, numbers, signatures. The room began to shift, not loudly, not chaotically, but with a growing weight, like something undeniable was taking shape right in front of them. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice sharper, more controlled. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, but Marcus did not look at him right away. Instead, he watched as each person at the table came to the same realization at their own pace, the same pause, the same tightening of posture, the same quiet recalculation happening behind their eyes. "It is exactly what it looks like," Marcus said finally, his tone even, almost calm, as if he were stating something ordinary, something expected. Ethan let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly. "No," he said, firmer now. "No. This is a shell, a front. You do not have the capital for this." Marcus met his gaze then, steady, unshaken. "I never said I did," he replied, and that single sentence hung in the air, incomplete but intentional. One of the older board members leaned back slowly, his chair creaking under the shift in weight. "The holding company. It owns the majority stake," he said, his voice quieter now, more careful. "And this signature." His finger traced a line at the bottom of the page, stopping at a name that had not been there before, or at least not where anyone had thought to look. Ethan's eyes followed, his expression tightening as he read it. Once, then again, like repetition might change what it said, but it did not. Marcus did not move, did not fill the silence. He simply stood there, allowing the realization to settle, layer by layer. "You are telling me," Ethan said slowly, each word measured now, stripped of its earlier confidence. That you control this? Marcus tilted his head slightly, not as a gesture of challenge, but of clarity. I am telling you, he said, his voice low but steady, that the company you are trying to protect has already changed hands. The words did not land all at once. They spread, moving through the room in quiet waves. One board member straightened in his chair, another closed the document slowly, as if the act itself required more care now. Ethan remained still for a second longer than the others, his jaw set, his posture rigid. But something in his expression had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, the absence of certainty. This does not make sense, he said finally, though his voice no longer carried the same edge. Why would you? He stopped himself before finishing the question, as if the answer might already be forming in a place he did not want to look. Marcus's gaze did not waver. That is the first question you should be asking, he said quietly, and as the room fell into a deeper, heavier silence, it became clear that nothing about this moment was what they had prepared for. Not the numbers, not the structure, and certainly not the man standing in front of them, who had once been dismissed without a second thought and was now impossible to ignore. Say it clearly. Ethan's voice cut through the silence, lower now, controlled but carrying something strained beneath it, like the weight of what he was beginning to understand was pressing against every word. Marcus did not move immediately. He let the room sit in that tension for a moment longer, watching how each person held themselves, who leaned forward, who leaned back, who avoided eye contact, and who could not look away. Then he placed his hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding the moment without force. Control has already transferred, he said, his tone steady, measured, each word landing without urgency, but impossible to ignore. A faint shift moved through the room, papers rustling, a chair adjusting, the quiet mechanics of people recalibrating in real time. One of the senior board members cleared his throat, his voice cautious now. If that is true, then the authority of this board, he trailed off, glancing at the documents again as if searching for a different answer. But there was none. Marcus continued without raising his voice. Remains intact, but under new ownership, he said, the clarity of it removing any space for interpretation. Ethan took a step closer, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. And you expect us to accept this without question? He asked, the edge returning slightly, though it no longer held the same certainty. Marcus met his gaze, calm, unshaken. You already have, he replied, a slight pause following. You just did not know it yet. The words settled deeper than before, because they were not confrontational, they were factual, and that made them harder to resist. A board member near the end of the table leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath. The capital flow, the restructuring, it lines up, he said quietly, almost reluctantly. Ethan looked around the room then, searching for resistance, for someone to push back. But what he found instead was hesitation, calculation, and something else beginning to form beneath it, recognition. Marcus reached into the folder and slid another document forward, a finalized agreement, signatures clean and complete, the kind that did not leave room for reversal. This is the final transfer, he said, effective as of this morning. The timing hung in the air, deliberate, precise. Ethan's eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly, then again more slowly, as if slowing down might reveal a flaw. But there was none. His hand rested on the table, fingers tightening slightly against the polished surface. Why? He asked finally. The question stripped down now, no longer defensive, just direct. Marcus did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch just enough to make the question matter. Then he spoke, his voice lower, more grounded. Because you were already losing it, he said, not as an insult, not as a judgment, just a statement of fact. A few heads shifted, subtle but noticeable, because they knew it was true, even if they had not said it out loud. Marcus continued. And because no one here was willing to change what was necessary, he added, his gaze moving briefly across the table, not accusing, just acknowledging. Ethan straightened slightly, something defensive rising again. So this is what? A lesson? He asked, but Marcus shook his head once, small, controlled. No, he said. This is a correction. The word landed differently, quieter but heavier, and for a moment, no one spoke. the room settling into a new kind of silence, not confusion, not denial, but adjustment, like the ground beneath them had shifted and they were still finding their balance. Marcus stepped back slightly from the table, not retreating, just giving the moment space to settle. And in that space, something became clear. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a transition, one that had already happened whether they were ready for it or not. And as the light from the windows brightened with the rising sun, casting a sharper clarity across the room, it revealed not just the documents on the table, but the quiet realization that the man they had once dismissed was now the one defining what came next. Then what happens to us? The question came from the far end of the table, quieter than the others, but somehow heavier, as if it carried more than just business. And Marcus turned his gaze toward the man who asked it, not immediately answering, not dismissing it either, just letting it exist in the space for a moment, because that was the real question now, not ownership, not control, but consequence. Marcus took a slow breath, his hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, grounding himself in the room that was no longer unfamiliar. That depends on what you choose to do next, he said, his voice calm, steady, not threatening, not reassuring, just honest. A subtle shift moved through the room, shoulders adjusting, eyes narrowing slightly, as if each person was now measuring themselves against something they had not prepared for. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, stepping back slightly from the table, the earlier sharpness in his posture giving way to something more restrained, more aware. "You expect us to just continue?" he asked, the hesitation in his voice not from lack of confidence, but from the absence of control. Marcus met his gaze without tension. "I expect you to do your jobs," he replied simply, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any long explanation could have. One of the board members leaned forward, hands clasped. "Together, and you," he asked, watching Marcus carefully now, "what is your role in all of this?" Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what it meant to say it out loud. "Oversight," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, direction when necessary. A quiet murmur followed, not disagreement, not acceptance, just adjustment, the slow process of understanding a new structure. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him in a way that was different now, less dismissive, more searching. "You could have let it collapse," he said, his voice lower, almost reflective. Taken what was left, walked away. Marcus's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, something quieter, deeper. "I could have," he said, a brief pause following before he added. "But that would not have fixed anything." The room stilled again, because that answer did not fit the expectation they had built around him. It did not match the version of him they had decided on years ago. One of the older members nodded slowly, almost to himself. "So this is not about proving something," he said, more a realization than a question. Marcus shook his head once, small but certain. "No," he replied, and that single word settled into the room with a weight that was difficult to ignore. Ethan looked down at the documents again, then back at Marcus, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge. "Then why come here today?" he asked, and for the first time, there was something almost genuine in the question, not defensive, not challenging, just searching. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, long enough to make sure the answer would land exactly where it needed to. "Because this is where the damage started," he said calmly, not raising his voice, not assigning blame, just stating something that had always been there, and the room absorbed it differently this time, not as an attack, but as a truth that connected more than just numbers and contracts. A silence followed, deeper than before, not uncomfortable, but reflective, like something unspoken had finally been acknowledged. Marcus stepped back slightly from the table again, not distancing himself, just allowing space for that realization to settle. And as the morning light continued to fill the room, brighter now, clearer, it revealed something none of them had expected to face, not just a shift in power, but a quiet confrontation with who they had been, and who they might still choose to become. "You cannot undo what has already been done," Ethan said quietly, his voice no longer sharp, no longer defensive, but carrying something heavier now, something closer to recognition. And Marcus stood across from him, without reacting immediately, letting the words settle into the room where they belonged. Because this was not a moment for interruption, it was a moment for understanding, the kind that came slowly. Almost reluctantly, Marcus finally nodded once, a small, controlled motion. "No," he said, his tone calm, grounded. "But you can decide what you do with it." The distinction hung there, subtle but important, and for the first time, no one tried to argue against it. One of the board members shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if holding on to something fragile. "If we continue," he said carefully, choosing each word with more intention than before, "then what changes?" Marcus stepped closer to the table, not to dominate the space, but to be clear, to be present. "Transparency," he said, without hesitation. "No more covering losses, no more decisions made to protect appearances over reality." A few glances moved across the room, quiet acknowledgments of things that had never been spoken out loud. Marcus continued, his voice steady, not louder, just clearer, "And accountability," he added, his gaze moving briefly to Ethan, not accusing, but including, at every level. The room absorbed it differently this time, not as resistance, but as a recalibration, the kind that comes when denial is no longer an option. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, a shift so small it might have gone unnoticed before, but now it meant something. "You are asking us to admit we were wrong," he said, not as a challenge, but as a realization. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I am asking you to stop pretending you were not," he replied, and the words did not cut. They settled, firm but not cruel, because they were not meant to punish, they were meant to clarify. Silence followed, deeper than before, but not empty. It was full of something changing, something realigning. One of the older members nodded slowly, almost to himself. "Then we start there," he said quietly, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any resistance could have. Ethan looked down at the table, at the documents, at the signatures that had already reshaped everything. And when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not acceptance, not fully, but something closer to it than anything before. "And you," he said, his voice steady now, "you are not here to replace us." Marcus shook his head once, calm, certain. "No," he said. "I am here to make sure what happens next is not built on the same mistakes." The clarity of it removed the last layer of tension from the room. Not completely, but enough to change the direction, to shift from resistance to possibility. Marcus reached forward and closed the folder slowly, the soft sound of it marking the end of something unspoken. Not a confrontation, not a victory, but a transition. He stepped back, giving the table space again. And as the morning light filled the room completely now, clear and steady, it revealed something none of them could ignore anymore. Not just who held the power, but how it would be used. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one questioned whether that answer had already been decided. "Marcus." Ethan's voice came again, quieter this time, almost uncertain, as the room began to settle into something unfamiliar, not tension, not resistance, but the slow acceptance of a reality that could not be reversed. Marcus paused near the door, his hand resting lightly against the handle, not turning it yet, just feeling the cool metal under his fingers, grounding himself in the moment. He glanced back over his shoulder, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge the voice. Ethan stood by the table, no longer at the head of it, his posture less rigid now, his expression carrying something that had not been there before, not pride, not authority, but something closer to humility, something harder to hold on to. "About before," Ethan said, the words coming slower, like each one had to be chosen carefully. The room remained quiet, no one interrupting, no one looking away, because this was not about business anymore, not entirely. Marcus did not speak, he just waited, giving the moment space to exist without forcing it forward. Ethan exhaled softly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again. "We were wrong," he said finally, the words simple, direct, but heavier than anything else he had said that morning. A subtle shift moved through the room, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet recognition that something had changed. Marcus studied him for a second, not searching for sincerity, not testing him, just seeing him as he was in that moment. Then he gave a small nod, once, controlled, not dismissive, not overly accepting, Just enough to acknowledge what had been said. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice calm, steady, without edge, without triumph. And that was what made it land differently, because he did not need the apology to define what had already been proven. Ethan seemed to take that in, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if something he had been holding onto had finally been set down. Marcus turned back to the door then, opening it slowly, the hallway outside bright with morning light, clean and sharp, the kind that made everything look clearer than it had before. He stepped out without hesitation, his footsteps quiet against the floor as the door closed gently behind him, leaving the room in a silence that felt different now. Not heavy, not uncertain, but reflective. Marcus walked down the hallway at an even pace, not rushed, not lingering, just moving forward, the glass walls beside him reflecting a version of himself that had nothing to do with where he came from or what they had called him, but everything to do with what he had chosen to become. Outside, the city had fully woken up, cars moving steadily, people crossing streets, the rhythm of a new day unfolding without pause. Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing against his face, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, not out of relief, just to feel the stillness beneath everything else. Then he opened them again and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A new message waiting, this time from Mrs. Alvarez, short, simple. "We saved you some breakfast." Marcus looked at it for a second, the corner of his expression softening just slightly. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and started walking, not toward the building behind him, not toward anything that needed to be reclaimed or proven, but toward something quieter, something already his. And as he moved through the morning light, there was no need to look back, because nothing behind him had the power to define what came next.